He bought a forgotten house for just $100, believing silence could heal a broken mind. But when he opened the door, he found a woman and 2 children hiding from winter and fate itself. Then the storm came. The warning was ignored, and one moment would decide who lived, who broke, and who stayed. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. Winter pressed down on the outskirts of Spokane, gray and quiet, as a forgotten auction hall gathered a handful of strangers and one man who wasn't looking for profit, only a place where his mind might finally rest. Michael Carter sat in the last row with his hands folded, feeling the old tension settle between his shoulders as if it had never left. Crowded rooms still did that to him. Not panic, he was long past panic, but a tight vigilance, a silent counting of exits, a listening for sounds that didn't exist. He told himself this was harmless, a public auction, folding chairs, fluorescent lights, no threat. Shadow lay at his feet, close enough that Michael could feel the dog's warmth through the sole of his boot. Not touching, not clinging, just present. Shadow didn't scan the room the way Michael did. Shadow listened, felt, judged. A low, steady calm flowed from the dog, grounding Michael better than any breathing exercise a therapist had ever taught him. The auctioneer cleared his throat and began reading from a sheet of paper with practiced boredom. Most people in the room had already decided they wouldn't bid. The property was a joke, a cabin long abandoned on the edge of town. No utilities guaranteed. Structural damage listed in bold, as is. Michael watched the screen at the front of the room flicker to life. A photograph appeared, a weather-beaten wooden house half buried in snow, windows dark, roof sagging like tired shoulders. Something in Michael's chest tightened. Not fear, not longing, but recognition. He knew that posture. He had worn it himself for years. "Opening bid," the auctioneer said. $1. A man near the front lifted his hand lazily. $1. Laughter rippled through the room. Not cruel laughter. Casual laughter. The kind that said this didn't matter. Michael didn't smile. $1, the auctioneer repeated. "Do I hear more?" Another voice chimed in, louder, amused. $10. More laughter. Someone clapped. Someone whistled. The house on the screen seemed to sink further into itself, as if absorbing the mockery. Michael felt Shadow shift. Not alarmed, attentive. $10. That was what the room thought the house was worth. Less than a night in a cheap motel. Less than the meds Michael used to refill every month when the nights got bad. The auctioneer waited. Silence stretched. The gavel hovered. Michael raised his hand. $100, he said. The room stilled, not dramatically, but enough. Heads turned, a few eyebrows lifted. The auctioneer blinked, glanced down at the paperwork, then back at Michael. $100, he repeated. Any other bids? No one answered. The gavel came down with a hollow crack that echoed louder than it should have. Sold. Just like that. Michael exhaled slowly, surprised to realize he'd been holding his breath. $100. A ridiculous price for a house, a dangerous price for hope. He didn't tell himself this was a fresh start. He didn't believe in fresh starts. He believed in pauses, in ceasefires, in places where the noise softened enough to let a man sleep. At the table near the exit, Michael signed papers with a pen that barely worked. The clerk slid the deed across to him, along with a single key taped to a cardboard tag. It felt lighter than it should have. Shadow stood as Michael stood, the dog's movement fluid, unhurried, ready. Outside, the cold bit harder. Snow crunched beneath Michael's boots as he walked to his truck. The town beyond the auction hall looked indifferent. Life went on. The auction would be forgotten by dinner. Michael drove without music. He always did. Sound filled his head too easily. Shadow sat in the passenger seat, watching the road, ears flicking at things Michael couldn't hear. The cabin lay at the end of a narrow road where the snow plows rarely bothered to go. Michael parked, cut the engine, and sat for a moment with his hands on the steering wheel. His heart was steady. That was new, or maybe just unfamiliar. "You ready?" he murmured, not sure if he meant himself or the dog. Shadow huffed softly. The door creaked when Michael pushed it open. The sound stopped him cold. His muscles tensed automatically, a reflex carved deep. He waited, listening. Nothing. The air inside smelled faintly of wood smoke. Fresh. Wrong. Michael stepped in slowly. His eyes adjusted to the dimness, tracking movement, cataloging shapes. A blanket on the couch, a pot on the stove, small boots near the door. A woman rose from the far side of the room, eyes wide, one arm instinctively shielding a child behind her. Another child sat on the floor, clutching something soft, staring at Shadow with open curiosity rather than fear. Shadow moved forward half a step and stopped, body low but controlled. Not aggressive, protective. Michael raised his hands, palms open. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," he said, voice steady, despite the sudden pounding in his ears. The woman swallowed. We didn't know anyone owned this place." Her voice wasn't defensive. It was exhausted. Michael looked around again, really looked this time. The cabin wasn't squatted in the way he'd expected. It was lived in, cleaned, warmed, repaired as much as someone with nothing could manage. He thought of the laughter in the auction hall. $1, $10, $100. "I bought it today," Michael said quietly. "At auction." The woman's face fell, not in shock, but in resignation, like someone hearing a verdict they'd already prepared for. Shadow sat down without being told. Michael felt the familiar urge to retreat, to regain control by drawing lines and issuing orders. He could call the sheriff. He could do what was legal, clean, final. Instead, he felt something else press against his ribs. Not weakness. Wait. "How long have you been here?" he asked. The woman hesitated. "Since the first snowfall." Michael nodded once. He knew what winter did to people with nowhere to go. He had seen it in other countries, other lives. He looked at the children, then at Shadow, who met his gaze with calm certainty. This was supposed to be his quiet, his pause, his place to heal. But the war inside him, the one that never made the news, shifted its shape. "Let's talk," Michael said. And for the first time since the gavel fell, he had no idea what would happen next. Snow settled thicker around the cabin as daylight faded, sealing the road behind Michael and forcing the moment to stretch longer than he had planned. Michael stood just inside the doorway, aware of how narrow the space suddenly felt, how the quiet pressed against his ears in a way that reminded him of rooms he had cleared years ago, rooms that had smelled of dust and fear instead of wood smoke and boiled water. He had expected emptiness when he bought the house, silence he could control, but now there were 3 breaths he did not own, and one steady presence at his side that seemed to be measuring the room on his behalf. Shadow did not move closer to the children, but Michael felt the dog's attention sharpen, not toward them as a threat, but toward Michael himself, as if waiting to see which version of him would speak next. The woman introduced herself as Emily, her words careful, like someone stepping across ice that might crack at any wrong emphasis. And Michael noticed how she kept her body angled between him and the children, without making a show of it, a posture he recognized from countless civilians he had escorted through danger zones, people who did not know tactics, but understood instinct. He listened as she explained how winter had arrived before she could find work, how shelters filled up, how the house had seemed abandoned enough to be invisible, and he felt a familiar irritation stir in him at the idea of systems that failed quietly and expected people to disappear with dignity. He told himself that this was not his responsibility, that ownership came with rights and options, that the law was clean even when life was not. but his mind kept returning to the auction hall, to the laughter at $1, to the way no one had cared what became of the structure or anything inside it. He thought of the key in his pocket, how light it had felt, and how heavy it was becoming by the second. When the older child spoke, asking whether they would have to leave that night, something in Michael's chest contracted sharply, not pain, but pressure. The same sensation he felt when a mission clock ran down faster than expected. He hated questions he could not answer with certainty. He turned his gaze to Shadow, grounding himself in the dog's calm certainty, remembering nights overseas when Shadow had learned to read his breathing, when a single hand signal meant trust or withdrawal, life or death. This was different, he told himself, but his body disagreed. He asked how long they had been there, what they needed, where they would go if they left, questions that felt procedural until the answers stacked up with nowhere to go. Emily spoke of snowstorms and closed roads and children who woke crying from cold dreams, and Michael noticed how she avoided words like fear or desperation, as if naming them might make them contagious. He paced once, then stopped, aware that the sound of his boots echoed too loudly in the small room, aware also that he was delaying a decision because delay had saved lives before, because hesitation sometimes bought time for better outcomes. He considered the sheriff's number stored in his phone, considered how simple it would be to step outside, make the call, let procedure take over, and he felt an unexpected resistance rise in him, not moral outrage, but something quieter, a refusal to be done with this moment so cleanly. He thought of why he had come here in the first place, of doctors' voices telling him he needed quiet, routine, a place without reminders, and he almost laughed at the irony of finding chaos instead, but then he realized this was not chaos in the way his nightmares were, not explosions or shouted commands, but a fragile order built from scraps, from people trying to stay warm and unseen. He told Emily that he had bought the house that day, that legally it was his now, and watched resignation settle over her features, a practiced acceptance that disturbed him more than anger would have. He felt the urge to correct it, to say something definitive, and surprised himself by offering time instead, 10 days spoken aloud before he could measure them, a number that felt both arbitrary and necessary, long enough to mean something, short enough to feel safe. He added that he would be staying as well, that he was not asking them to vanish into the night, and he saw a flicker of disbelief in Emily's eyes that mirrored his own internal uncertainty. He set rules because structure was how he functioned, because lines made the world navigable, and he watched as Shadow relaxed fractionally, sensing the tension ease, not because danger was gone, but because direction had been chosen. As evening deepened, Michael took stock of the cabin with new eyes, noticing repairs done carefully, the way the firewood was stacked, the quiet competence of someone making do without announcing it, and he felt a complicated mix of intrusion and gratitude that he did not yet have language for. He ate little when Emily offered food, his appetite dulled by thought, and he retreated to the front room with Shadow when the children were settled, listening to the wind move through the trees like distant surf. Lying on the narrow bed later, he found that sleep did not come easily, not because of noise, but because of awareness, because the cabin now held other lives whose rhythms he could not ignore. And as he stared into the dark, counting breaths the way he had been taught, he wondered whether the quiet he had come here to find would turn out to be something he had to share rather than claim, a possibility that unsettled him even as it pulled at something he had not expected to feel again. Morning arrived muted and pale, snow still clinging to the trees, as the cabin woke slowly to a rhythm Michael had not planned for and could no longer pretend did not exist. Michael woke before the others, not because of a nightmare, but because his body no longer trusted sleep to decide its own ending. He lay still, listening, cataloging sounds the way he always did, the wind against the walls, the distant crack of ice somewhere outside, the faint breathing from the back room that told him the night had passed without incident. Shadow was awake too. Michael could feel it without looking. The dog's attention stretched through the space like a quiet wire, alert but not tense, as if this place had already been measured and found temporarily safe. Michael sat up slowly, giving his pulse time to settle, aware that the familiar heaviness in his chest was absent, replaced instead by a dull unease that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with responsibility. He dressed without ceremony and stepped outside, the cold biting cleanly into his lungs, grounding him more effectively than any medication. Snow needed clearing, he told himself, because snow always needed clearing, because tasks with clear beginnings and ends made sense. Shadow followed him out, stopping at the edge of the yard, head tilted, reading the air the way Michael read maps. As Michael shoveled, he caught himself thinking about the children, about how small their boots had looked by the door, about the way Emily had said, "Thank you," without expecting it to change anything. He told himself again that this was temporary, that 10 days was a line he had drawn for a reason, yet each scoop of snow felt like a small investment in something he claimed he did not intend to keep. When he went back inside, the smell of coffee surprised him, not unpleasantly, but enough to tighten his jaw, and he found Emily at the small counter, moving quietly as if the cabin itself might object to sudden motion. She greeted him without apology, without expectation, and he noticed how she did not ask permission to exist in the space, only adjusted herself to fit it, a skill he recognized from people who had learned not to be noticed unless necessary. They spoke briefly about weather and roads and nothing that mattered, and Michael felt the odd relief of conversation that did not demand explanations. The children emerged soon after, tentative but curious, and Shadow shifted position to place himself where he could see them all at once, a choice that eased something in Michael he had not realized was tight. He watched the older child reach out slowly, palm open, the universal language of cautious trust, and felt his own breath hitch when Shadow accepted it, calm and dignified, as if this were simply another watch, another perimeter redefined. Michael spent the morning inspecting the cabin, noting repairs that had been done with care rather than skill, nails placed where they mattered most, drafts blocked with whatever was available, and he understood that this place had not been occupied thoughtlessly but defended, held against the season with quiet determination. The realization unsettled him because it reframed the cabin not as an abandoned object he had purchased, but as a shelter that had already been claimed by necessity. When a knock came at the door near midday, Michael's body reacted before his mind, shoulders tightening, gaze snapping to the entry, shadow rising in one smooth motion, and then relaxing just as quickly when an older man stepped inside, introduced simply as a neighbor who checked on the road and the weather. The man spoke easily, asked questions that sounded like small talk, but carried the weight of someone taking inventory of who belonged where. And Michael answered carefully, aware that every word shaped a narrative he was not ready to commit to. The neighbor's presence was brief but lingering, a reminder that isolation here was thinner than Michael had assumed, that even forgotten places were observed in their own way. After the door closed, Michael felt the echo of it, the sense that his quiet refuge was already part of a wider pattern of attention and expectation. The afternoon passed in a series of small domestic acts that felt foreign and strangely demanding, fixing a hinge, stacking firewood, helping the children carry water, tasks that required patience rather than precision, presence rather than force. Michael noticed how often his thoughts drifted back to past deployments, to moments when his usefulness had been unquestioned, his role sharply defined, and he felt a flicker of resentment at how ambiguous everything felt now, how success could not be measured or confirmed. Yet when the older child laughed at something Shadow did, a sound clear and unguarded, Michael felt that resentment falter, replaced by a cautious warmth that frightened him more than anger ever had. Evening came early, the light thinning until the cabin seemed to draw inward, and Michael found himself sitting at the small table, listening rather than speaking, absorbing the cadence of another family's routine as if it were a language he might one day need to speak fluently. He thought of the doctors who had told him he needed calm, of the years he had spent alone believing calm meant emptiness, and he wondered if they had meant something else entirely. That night, as the fire burned low and the children slept, Michael sat with Shadow by the window, watching snow drift steadily down, feeling the quiet settle not as absence, but as a shared state, and for the first time since he arrived, he allowed himself to consider that the 10 days he had offered might not be a countdown, but a threshold, one he would have to decide whether to cross when the time came. Winter tightened its grip overnight, turning steps to glass, and the cabin into a small island where movement itself demanded attention and choice. The sound reached Michael before the words did, a sharp, involuntary intake of breath, followed by a dull thud that made his muscles react as if to incoming fire, and he was on his feet before he consciously understood what had happened. Shadow already moving, not toward the noise, but toward Michael, aligning instinctively with the center of decision. Emily was on the ground near the back steps, one hand braced against the wood, the other clutching her ankle, her face pale with the kind of pain that doesn't shout because it can't afford to. Michael knelt without thinking, the old procedural calm sliding into place, assessing rather than panicking, asking questions in a steady voice that surprised him with its softness. She said she had slipped on ice, said it was nothing, said she could stand, and then proved herself wrong when her weight shifted and her breath caught again. A quiet, defeated sound that told Michael more than any description could. He helped her inside, moving carefully, aware of the children watching from the doorway with eyes that tracked every motion, and he felt the unfamiliar pressure of being observed not as a professional, but as a constant presence whose actions would echo long after the moment passed. Shadow stayed close, not interfering, but Michael felt the dog's attention flick back and forth between Emily and the children, a silent calculation of vulnerability and priority that mirrored Michael's own internal triage. Emily protested resting, insisted she could manage, listed what still needed doing, as if momentum itself were a form of protection, and Michael found himself pushing back gently, insisting in a way that felt strangely intimate, telling her to sit, to let it be for one day, a phrase he realized he had never successfully applied to his own life. With Emily forced to stillness, the weight of the day shifted onto Michael in ways he had not anticipated, and he quickly learned that vigilance in this context required a different set of muscles, ones that tired faster and complained louder. Breakfast burned while he distracted himself, helping the younger child with a simple task that became inexplicably complicated, and when he noticed the smell it was too late. Smoke curling up to the ceiling as if mocking his assumption that control transferred cleanly between domains. The children reacted not with fear but with laughter, and the sound unsettled Michael more than irritation would have, because laughter was unpredictable, because it demanded response rather than correction. Shadow moved through the cabin with deliberate neutrality, positioning himself between hazards and small bodies, blocking a spill before Michael noticed it, pausing at doorways as if to remind Michael that thresholds mattered. Michael felt clumsy, too large for the space, too slow for the pace, and the frustration that rose in him had no clear target, which made it harder to contain. He caught himself snapping once, immediately regretted it, and watched the older child's shoulders tense before she recovered, the speed of that adjustment striking him like a rebuke. He apologized, the word awkward in his mouth, and was startled by how quickly it smoothed the moment, how easily the children accepted it as sufficient, a lesson in repair he had never been taught. A knock came mid-morning, and Michael braced again before recognizing the older neighbor from the previous day, who stepped in carrying supplies without ceremony, commenting on the ice, the cold, the way winter demanded cooperation whether one liked it or not, and Michael noted how the man addressed Emily with concern rather than pity, how he accepted Michael's presence as a fact rather than a question. The visit was brief but grounding, a reminder that the cabin did not exist outside of human context, that isolation here was a choice rather than a condition, and as the door closed, Michael felt something settle, not relief, but responsibility shared thinly across a wider field. The afternoon blurred into a sequence of small crises that required patience instead of strength. Tears soothed, messes cleaned imperfectly, plans adjusted and readjusted, and Michael realized with a mixture of disbelief and reluctant respect that this kind of endurance demanded more sustained attention than any operation he had led. Emily watched from the chair, torn between gratitude and guilt, and Michael found himself reassuring her without fully understanding why it mattered to him that she believed he was capable, that he was not merely tolerating the situation, but inhabiting it. Shadow lay where he could see everyone, eyes half-lidded but alert, a steady presence that absorbed the chaos without reacting to it, and Michael felt the echo of shared history in that stillness, the memory of nights when Shadow had waited for a command that never came, because Michael had already known there was nothing to do but stay. As evening approached, the cabin felt smaller and warmer, the earlier tension replaced by a tired equilibrium that Michael recognized from long days in the field, when survival depended on cooperation rather than heroics. He ate whatever he had managed not to ruin, sitting at the table with the children while Emily rested, and noticed how naturally they filled the silence with commentary, questions, observations that required no solutions, only acknowledgement. The simplicity of that exchange left him oddly exposed because it offered no cover, no role to hide behind, only presence as itself. When night finally settled and the children slept, Michael felt the delayed weight of the day press into his bones, exhaustion layered with a quiet satisfaction that unsettled him because it contradicted his long-held belief that attachment was a liability. Sitting by the window with Shadow watching ice form along the edges of the glass, Michael admitted to himself that the fear rising in him was not of failure, but of loss, the realization that something had begun to matter before he had decided whether it was safe to let it do so, and as he considered the days remaining in the 10 he had offered, he understood that the countdown no longer felt like protection, but like pressure, a narrowing corridor leading toward a choice he was not yet ready to name. A black SUV cut through the quiet road like a blade, stopping in front of the cabin as winter light thinned, bringing with it the weight of a past Michael had not invited back. Michael heard the engine before he saw the vehicle, the low, confident hum, triggering a reflex he had learned to distrust, and he felt Shadow's attention snap into focus, not alarmed but wary, a subtle tightening that told Michael this was not weather or wildlife, but a human variable approaching fast. The man who stepped out wore familiarity like armor, easy confidence built on money and movement, and when he called Michael's name, it landed with the precision of an old call sign, instantly collapsing distance Michael had worked hard to maintain. Ryan Miller did not need introduction. The history between them filled the space before words did, shared deployments, nights when survival depended on trust rather than rank, the unspoken bond of men who had learned each other's limits under pressure, and believed that knowledge would last forever. Ryan smiled as if time had paused, talked as if nothing fundamental had changed, and Michael felt the old pull of that certainty, the seductive simplicity of belonging to a world where roles were defined and outcomes measured. Shadow placed himself at Michael's side, not blocking, not retreating, a quiet assertion of alignment that steadied Michael even as the conversation shifted. Ryan spoke of his company without ceremony, security contracts, high-end clients, predictable money, and the language he used was efficient and clean, stripping risk of its consequences, framing protection as a commodity rather than a cost. He said Michael's name again, slower this time, and told him there was a place waiting, that skills like theirs did not rust, that poverty was a trap. No one escaped by sitting still. Michael listened, jaw set, aware of Emily's presence somewhere inside the cabin, aware of how words traveled through thin walls, whether invited or not. Ryan glanced toward the house, and his expression tightened briefly, not with concern, but assessment, the quick calculation of value that had become second nature to him. And Michael recognized the moment when respect tipped into judgment. Ryan spoke about choices, about refusing to be left behind, about how they had both grown up knowing what it meant to have nothing. And Michael felt something cold settle in his stomach as Ryan dismissed the cabin with a shrug, dismissed the quiet with a laugh, dismissed the people inside without naming them, reducing complexity to a mistake that could be corrected with money and momentum. Michael said no, quietly at first, then more firmly when Ryan pushed, and the refusal felt heavier than he expected, not because he doubted it, but because he knew what it would cost. Ryan's smile thinned, his voice sharpening as he asked whether Michael had chosen to stay poor, whether this was some kind of penance, whether hiding in a forgotten house with strangers counted as healing. Shadow shifted closer, sensing the shift not as threat, but as fracture. And Michael felt the old anger stir, not explosive but controlled, the kind that came from being seen incorrectly by someone who should have known better. He told Ryan he was done, that the work Ryan described would take more than it gave, that he was not interested in trading one kind of noise for another, and when Ryan scoffed, Michael realized the contempt was not personal but structural, aimed at anything that could not be leveraged. Ryan left with a final look that carried both disappointment and disdain, the engine roaring back to life as if to prove a point, and the road swallowed him quickly, leaving behind silence that felt newly fragile. Michael stood where he was for a moment, Shadow's presence anchoring him, and tried to convince himself that this encounter had changed nothing, that his decision had been made long before the SUV arrived. Inside the cabin, Emily had heard enough to draw her own conclusions, and Michael felt it before he saw it, the shift in atmosphere, the careful way she moved as if already packing herself away. She did not confront him, did not ask questions that would have demanded reassurance, and the absence of accusation unsettled him more than anger would have. He noticed small changes, the way she avoided his eyes, the way her voice flattened when she spoke, the way she gathered papers later that evening and sat alone, calculating quietly, and Michael recognized the posture of someone preparing to leave without permission. He wanted to explain, to say that his refusal had nothing to do with her and everything to do with a life he no longer wanted, but words felt clumsy and late, and the part of him trained to act decisively hesitated, unsure how to move without causing harm. Shadow watched Emily with a steadiness that suggested understanding rather than suspicion, a patience Michael envied, and as night settled over the cabin, Michael found himself counting the days again, not as protection this time, but as loss, sensing that the 10 he had offered were slipping from his control. When Emily finally spoke, it was to say she had found a place, distant and affordable, and that she would leave when the time came. And Michael felt the weight of that certainty press into him, heavier than any contract Ryan had mentioned. He nodded because he did not yet know how to ask her to stay without turning his choice into a debt. And as he lay awake later, with Shadow's steady breathing nearby, listening to the wind rise outside, he wondered whether the real poverty Ryan feared was not lack of money, but the risk of choosing a life that could be broken by caring too much. A risk Michael realized he might already have taken without admitting it to himself. The storm announced itself in fragments before it arrived, wind rising in uneven breaths around the cabin as night pressed close, and the sense of shelter began to feel provisional rather than promised. Michael moved through the small kitchen with the stiff concentration of someone performing an unfamiliar ritual under observation, aware of how each sound carried farther after dark, aware also of the silence he was trying to protect, as if a careful arrangement of plates and heat might convince the night to remain at bay. He told himself the dinner mattered, because it was an action he could complete, because food had always been a way to mark survival rather than comfort. And yet his hands shook slightly as he worked, not from fear but from the effort of staying present. Shadow paced once, twice, then stopped near the door, posture alert, in a way Michael recognized instantly, the same tension that had preceded mortar fire or sudden movement beyond a wire. The dog's attention fixed on the unseen, on pressure in the air rather than sound. And Michael felt the warning register even as he dismissed it, telling himself the wind was only wind, that winter always sounded worse than it was. He spoke aloud to steady himself, a habit he had never fully shaken, and Shadow's eyes met his briefly, not accusing, only waiting, as if marking the moment when instinct was offered and declined. Emily hovered nearby, torn between gratitude and restraint, and Michael felt the weight of her earlier decision pressing between them, the unspoken knowledge that this meal was both an attempt and an apology he had not yet found words for. Outside, the wind shifted again, striking the walls with a heavier insistence, and the lights flickered once, twice, before holding enough to send a thread of unease through Michael that he tamped down by focusing on the next step, the next motion. He told himself he had lived through worse than a winter storm, that roofs and walls were easier to trust than men with weapons. And yet Shadow moved back to the door, then to the window, then back to Michael, repeating the circuit with growing urgency. When a sharp crack sounded above them, like wood snapping under strain, Michael froze, recognition flooding him too late, and the world lurched as the cabin shuddered, a section of the roof giving way under the sudden weight of wind and snow. The sound was not explosive, but final, a tearing collapse that dropped cold and debris into the room in a rush that erased thought. And Michael moved on instinct alone, shouting names, grabbing bodies, feeling Shadow surge forward with him rather than away, the dog's presence a force at his side rather than a liability. The older child cried out, a sound that cut through everything else, and Michael's hands found her in the chaos, blood on his fingers, not his own, a sharp, immediate injury that demanded action without analysis. He registered Emily's scream distantly, the way he had once registered radio chatter amid gunfire, and he forced himself into the narrow calm that had kept others alive, assessing damage, applying pressure, lifting carefully, despite the panic clawing at his chest. Shadow stood between them and the open breach, body angled into the wind as if pushing back against it, and Michael felt a flash of bitter understanding at how clearly the dog had read the signs he had chosen to ignore. There was no question of staying now, no calculation of comfort or boundaries, only the immediate necessity of movement, and Michael wrapped the child in what he could find, his coat, a blanket, anything that would hold heat, speaking steadily even as the storm roared louder, as if offended by their attempt to escape it. He carried her into the night, snow striking his face hard enough to sting, visibility collapsing into a white wall that swallowed direction, and Shadow ran ahead, stopping, recalibrating, choosing a path through instinct rather than memory. Michael followed without question, trusting that guidance with a depth born of shared survival, his own training narrowed to the single objective of reaching help before shock set in fully. Emily stumbled after them, calling out, and Michael adjusted his pace, anchoring them together despite the conditions, every step a negotiation with ice and fear. The road was nearly invisible, the world reduced to movement and breath, and Michael felt the old edge of exhaustion rise, the part of him that knew how quickly strength could bleed away if he let panic take hold. He focused on counting steps, on Shadow's shape ahead, on the weight in his arms that demanded endurance rather than heroics, and he realized with a strange clarity that this was the kind of test he had not expected to face again, not against an enemy, but against indifference, against weather and chance, and his own earlier refusal to listen. The hospital lights emerged suddenly, harsh and unreal through the snow, and Michael felt a surge of relief, sharp enough to hurt, handing the child over to waiting hands with a precision that surprised the staff and left him shaking once there was nothing left to hold. Inside, warmth hit him all at once, his body reacting violently to the change, and he leaned against a wall, Shadow pressing close, the dogs breathing steady as if lending him rhythm. Emily stood nearby, eyes wide with fear and gratitude, and something like accusation that Michael accepted without defense, because he knew it was earned, because the warning had been there, and he had chosen his own judgment instead. Time stretched and contracted in unfamiliar ways as they waited, Michael's thoughts circling the image of the cabin collapsing, the sound of wood giving way, the knowledge that a decision made earlier had rippled forward into consequence. When a doctor finally spoke, brief and efficient, explaining injuries that were serious but manageable, Michael felt his knees weaken, the release almost as overwhelming as the fear had been, and he sank into a chair, Shadow settling at his feet, a silent witness to failure and recovery alike. He did not pray, not in words, but he made a promise without sound to listen next time, to treat warnings as gifts rather than inconveniences, to accept that survival did not excuse dismissal. As the storm continued to howl outside, locked away by glass and light, Michael understood that the cabin was no longer just a place he had bought cheaply or a refuge he could retreat from at will, but a site of consequence, altered irreversibly, and that whatever decision awaited him when morning came would be shaped by the knowledge that ignoring connection, whether human or otherwise, carried a cost he was no longer willing to pay. Morning broke pale and restrained outside the hospital, snow settling into stillness as the storm retreated, leaving behind a silence heavy with consequence rather than peace. Michael sat rigid in the narrow chair outside the treatment room, hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles ached, aware of every sound in the corridor and of how little any of it was under his control. The adrenaline that had carried him through the storm had drained away, leaving a hollow fatigue that pressed down on him from the inside, the kind that came not from exertion, but from aftermath, from knowing that what had happened could not be undone. Shadow lay at his feet, not sleeping, not pacing, simply present, and Michael felt the dog's steadiness as a counterweight to the self-reproach looping through his thoughts, the memory of ignored warnings replaying with a clarity that felt merciless. Emily stood nearby, arms wrapped around herself, her eyes fixed on the closed door as if will alone might open it, and Michael understood that the distance between them was no longer about uncertainty or misunderstanding, but about something more fragile, the fear that caring deeply invited catastrophe. When the doctor emerged, speaking in careful, measured terms, explaining that the injury was serious but treatable, that the child would recover with time and care, Michael felt his chest constrict sharply, relief and guilt colliding, until he had to lean forward, elbows on knees, breathing through the surge as he had learned long ago. Emily cried then, quietly at first, then with abandon, and Michael did not try to stop her or offer platitudes, knowing that some releases did not need correction, only space. He remained where he was, letting the moment unfold without asserting control, a small but significant departure from the instincts that had defined him for most of his life. Hours passed in a blur of administrative details and waiting, and when Emily was finally allowed to see her child, Michael stayed back with Shadow, recognizing that his presence there would be intrusion rather than support, another lesson he had learned too late too often. He watched through the glass as Emily sat by the bed, her posture bent protectively inward, and he felt a quiet certainty take shape within him, not as a sudden revelation, but as the settling of something that had been shifting since the auction hall, since the laughter at $1 and the decision to raise his hand anyway. When Emily returned, eyes red but steadier, Michael spoke without preamble, telling her that he had refused Ryan's offer not out of stubbornness or pride, but because the life it represented no longer aligned with what he needed to survive, that he had not come to the cabin to hide but to stop running from himself. He told her that the house was damaged, that it might take time to make it safe again, and that if she still chose to leave, he would not stand in her way, but that if she stayed, it would not be as a favor or a debt, but as a shared decision, one made with eyes open to risk. Emily listened in silence, the weight of the night still fresh in her expression, and Michael did not rush to fill the space, understanding that this was not a negotiation, but an offering that had to be accepted freely, or not at all. Shadow lifted his head then, gaze moving between them with an attentiveness that felt almost deliberate, and Michael was struck by the realization that the dog had followed him through violence and chaos without question, yet now waited as if acknowledging that this choice was not his to guide. Emily spoke finally, her voice unsteady but resolute, saying that she was tired of surviving by leaving, that she could not promise bravery but could promise honesty, and that for now she would stay not because it was safe but because it mattered. The simplicity of the statement cut through Michael more cleanly than any speech could have, and he nodded once, accepting the terms as they were. The days that followed unfolded quietly, repairs begun with the help of neighbors who arrived without ceremony, the cabin reshaped not into perfection, but into something sturdier, marked by effort rather than ownership. Michael declined further calls from Ryan without anger or explanation, feeling no need to justify a path that no longer intersected with his former life, and he noticed with a subdued surprise how little he missed the certainty of contracts and missions once he stopped measuring his worth by outcomes alone. He found new routines instead, helping with recovery appointments, learning the rhythms of shared mornings, allowing himself to be present without scanning for exits, a discipline that proved more demanding than any training he had endured. Shadow adapted seamlessly, shifting from sentinel to anchor, a living reminder that loyalty did not require constant threat to sustain itself. On a morning thick with frost but free of urgency, Michael stood outside the cabin watching Emily and the children move through the yard, aware of the quiet repair taking place within him, the gradual easing of a vigilance that had once felt essential to survival. He understood then that the house he had bought for $100 had never been the point, that its value lay in what it had forced him to confront and what it now allowed him to choose, and that healing, like trust, was not a destination but a practice renewed daily through attention and restraint. As the season edged slowly toward thaw, Michael felt no need to name the future or secure it against loss, content instead to inhabit the present with a steadiness earned rather than assumed, knowing that the war he had been fighting all along had not been against memory or fear, but against the belief that solitude was the only form of safety he deserved, a belief he finally laid down as he closed the cabin door one evening and found that for the first time in years, the quiet waiting inside did not feel empty, but complete. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder or light from the sky. Sometimes God answers quietly, through a door that opens at the wrong time, a house worth $100, a warning we almost ignore, or a stranger we are asked to protect before we are ready. This story is a reminder that healing often comes disguised as responsibility, and grace often appears where we least expect it. If this story touched your heart, let it be a sign to slow down, to listen, to choose compassion in your own daily life, because God often works through ordinary moments and imperfect people. If you believe in small miracles, please share this story with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment to tell us where you are watching from or what this story meant to you, and subscribe to the channel so more stories like this can reach hearts that are still waiting. May God bless you, protect you, and guide you and your loved ones through every storm, seen and unseen.